What's up, everybody? What you're about to see is one of those converdiction things that Theory Underground puts on. What are those? They are contradiction conversations, not meant to be debates where a side wins and a side loses, so much as something for people who are just trying to understand the contradiction itself. Being able to see the two sides articulate themselves and make sense of themselves in the presence of the other. I, as the host, David McKerracher, try to put on a convivial atmosphere and also dig in a little deeper if someone is vague or doesn't really respond to something. But besides that, I kind of let it happen. And this one is hopefully going to give you a lot of food for thought. Okay, now this is where I have to do my quick little disclaimer. Whenever I do stuff with leftists come around. They're used to everything on the internet that they consume being made just for them or for their hate watching enjoyment. Okay, well, Theory Underground is not making stuff for a specifically leftist audience, and I myself do not identify that way. Anyway, look, the point here is to create a learning environment for people who want to, well, pretty much learn to try to understand the situation. And of course, along the way, we'll want to hear from people who see the world different ways. And a lot of the people that I do bring on are leftists. In fact, most of them are, because in the world of theory, you could just say that leftists are disproportionately represented or whatever. But just don't go support Theory Underground and then get mad later when you find out that we're not a lefty org. The point here is to connect with people who are burnt out on activism, burnt out on academia, burnt out on partying, who are looking to get more serious about life, who are looking to get into or back to the questions themselves, the concepts, the thinkers, the texts, and ultimately to try to inform their own understanding. And the main people I keep in mind are workers with earbuds who are critical and trying to think for themselves. And a lot of them are not committed to any one political ideology or ism for that matter. All right? So if that's okay with you and you can still kick it, then welcome. With that, I think it's going to be a good one. I remember when this happened. Obviously, I was there. But of course, it's been a while. And some people saw this, some people didn't. Well, now it's an opportunity to see it as a standalone episode, not in the context of a giant 17-hour live stream. So, yeah. And if you're curious about what Theory Underground is, stick around till the end. I have a PSA made just for you. Enjoy. I wanted to start by describing what I took to be the situation, which was I had Matt McManus on to talk about Nietzsche, Heidegger, reading philosophers politically, basically. And I think the reason I initially wanted to do that conversation, Matt, was because when I first caught a glimmer of your work, I was like, interesting, because that's kind of my approach to Heidegger. After reading Tut, I was like, oh, so that's also a Nietzsche thing, except that for me, I think the big difference between myself and Tut, maybe yourself as well, I haven't read enough of you yet, but I'm working on it, is that I often think that that's why these thinkers are valuable, is because they don't hold certain commitments, and not holding certain commitments or operating assumptions gives them the ability to see and think about things that would otherwise be lost on me. And so, I like it in that sort of basic, sort of liberal, like maybe I'm too open-minded kind of sense. I want to be able to take on more perspectives and what have you. And that was a great conversation. I thought we will do a little introduction thing. You'll each get to say a couple things about your work and everything in a second. But I want to set this up really quick to say, I thought that was an awesome conversation. Spencer has a problem, and it's called when he's supposed to be doing anthology work for Platypus, he's productively procrastinating by watching us, right? And it's a problem I think that most academics, at least the ones who get on YouTube at all, share, which is like, you're supposed to be doing this thing, but you're getting your enjoyment, from the YouTube thing. And so then he's in there kind of arguing, but I wasn't really following along with it too much. And then people were like, you should bring Spencer on. And I was feeling super energized because I always feel really hyped on these kinds of conversations. And so I was like, yeah, I'm not going to go to bed anytime soon. Let's do it. And so I messaged him and brought him on. And I didn't realize he was going to disagree with you pretty strongly on some things. And I'll let you kind of both speak for your own selves and your positions. But I also understand you're both coming from the Platypus Convention that just happened at the beginning of the month and that Spencer interviewed you. And so the two of you have already been talking, but my audience hasn't gotten to hear it yet. And so I'm curious about how that conversation went, and then what you both think your points of agreement and disagreement are going to be in this conversation. Let's start with Matt.
Sure. Well, I had a good time in Chicago. It was a really fucking long, busy day. I'm not going to lie about that because I presented at Midwest Political Science Association, and then I went and got interviewed by Spencer, and then there was a big 4-hour panel. So by the end of it, needless to say, I needed a drink. But a lot of what we talked about had more to do with my work on things like liberal socialism and its relationship to Marxism, which is an important topic that we can discuss. What we're here to talk about today is something more I suppose, interesting in some ways than my own thoughts about liberal socialism, and that's Nietzsche, right? And the reason for this conversation is Spencer and I have long disagreed about the role that Nietzsche should play in a constructive left-wing critical theory or left-wing philosophy. I think that there is a place for Nietzsche on the left in the constructive sense that we can appropriate many of his ideas and put them to useful tasks or ask more engaging kinds of problems or ask me engaging kinds of questions through thinking through his work. But I do think ultimately that Nietzsche is fundamentally a reactionary thinker. Indeed, in my book, The Political Right and Inequality, I characterize Nietzsche as the greatest reactionary thinker of all time. And Spencer disagrees, or at least typically does, with that characterization. Spencer has some good reasons for that, so I'll let him talk and then we can get into it.
Yes, you guys can hear me. Yeah, the interview that I did of Matt at the Platypus Convention was about Matt's work. I hope that we stayed focused on that. So it wasn't really about some sort of debate. Of course, I tried to draw out some of the implications of his work on liberal socialism, but yeah, this is a different conversation. And it's I guess interesting as Matt puts it. It's I hope that some of the stakes can come out, because obviously it's not about Nietzsche per se. I mean, we can talk about Nietzsche. Obviously, we will talk about Nietzsche, but it's really an ethic of how to think and read. And I think underlying it is a question of how we understand history, and how we understand the history of the present. So how do we think about our relationship to history? And I think that troubles some of these categories of left and right, even liberal and socialist. And I'd like to, at least suggest some of the ways that I think that that's the case.
And then, so that's where you would both disagree strongest. I think it's probably where we will spend a lot of the time in this conversation. But first, I also want to check. So, Spencer, when it comes to Matt's, what he calls liberal socialism, do you pretty much just agree with that position? Or is there some nuance or disagreement that you bring to that?
I don't agree. It really has to do with the way that we understand history. I think that, I don't think that liberalism is like a thought among many, like it's like a school of thought. I also, I don't agree with a kind of disembodied, I know Matt will disagree with this, but it goes beyond like what I think most, at least young leftists, call materialism, which is I don't agree about how liberalism is a part of history. I would say that liberalism is constitutive of our, it's the conscious expression of our social relations. It's what Marx called bourgeois ideology. It's the form of it's the freedom thought, this freedom thinking that arose with bourgeois society, and that, of course, struggled to bring bourgeois society fully into existence, because bourgeois society couldn't be brought into existence except as a conscious project. It demanded, conscious clarification and ultimately political revolution. So that to me is like, when we're talking about liberalism, we're talking about the legacy of the Enlightenment, right? We're talking about the legacy of the thinkers who thought through the emergence of the form of social relations that we have. This, by the way, has all sorts of implications for what your last contradiction conversation was talking about, in terms of how to think about Christianity, how to think about the history of civilization, where do we stand in the history of civilization. Ultimately, it's a question of how you understand history in the broadest possible terms. So to me, socialism doesn't have to be liberal, right? It just is liberal. It is engaged with the thinking of our society, and of course, it struggles for liberalism. The other thing I would say is that liberalism is not the same thing as democracy, and there's a big, pardon my saying so, Maoist conflation of democratic rights with liberalism. Right, democracy for me, and this is just a historical Marxist position, is the political expression of the crisis of liberalism. It's the form of politics, and ultimately the form of state, that is expressive of the crisis of our bourgeois social relations, of the self-contradiction of the commodity form of labor. So you were talking earlier in the stream, Dave, about your love of capital, of Marx's Das Kapital. I would say that's an analysis of democracy, right? What Marx is talking about there is the social crisis that gives rise to the necessity of democracy and the imperialist state. That's the political, if you will, efflux of the crisis of the commodity form of freedom, or the self-contradiction of that form of freedom. So just throwing a lot of things out there, but
Yeah.
that has ultimately that's a story about what is early modernity, what is the Enlightenment, what is bourgeois revolution, what is 1848, what is Marx's moment, right? What is its aftermath, what is Marxism, and ultimately what is the 20th century and where we are, right? So I would say that we disagree on the way to think about these things. And to me, like, Adam Smith or liberalism is just where all socialists begin. It's Adam Smith is the socialist thinker, or the Enlightenment is the thought of socialism. It's the thought of cooperation, peace, of cosmopolitanism, right? All of the dreams of socialism are coming out of the Enlightenment, and socialism is an expression, a symptomatic expression of the crisis of that in what Marx calls capital.
So liberalism is not the same thing as democracy. The bourgeois revolution is not necessarily the same thing as either liberalism or democracy, and modernity is kind of its own thing as well. But all of these are
The bourgeois revolution is of course driven by liberalism, right? Which is why the bourgeois revolutions are not democratic.
But you
right?
don't.
They're not fundamental.
But you don't see liberalism as an ideology or a set of ideas so much as you see it as just the material fundamental reality of capitalism. This is your materialist, like, it's a value form. Really, the relations and the ideas are just reflecting the value form. Is that what you're saying?
I'm saying that liberalism is, if you will, the expression of our social relations. They are the expression of the relations of production. That
Right.
we are commodities, we own ourselves, we have rights. Those are enumerated, of course, politically. I completely agree with Matt that those, what we think about as liberal rights are absolutely crucial. That's at the heart of Marxism. Marx, Engels in the First International, later Marxists, they all say, look, democracy is, that's fine, but don't sacrifice one of your rights for it, right? So that's, very famously Marx and Engels's, commentary or criticism of the Lassalleans, is that he's willing to make peace with the authoritarian Prussian state and thus a limitation on the right to speech, to assemble, to due process of law, etc., all of which are essential for the self-organization of the working class, for the right to vote, for universal suffrage, right? And obviously none of those rights can be sacrificed at all. I mean, they are in crisis in capitalism, but the working class has to struggle for those liberal rights. So, I would say that the struggle for socialism, this is dependent upon liberal rights and is an assertion of liberal rights, and is a project of the bourgeoisification of the working class. That's what it's about.
All right, so that's a good setup for you then, and then we'll I'm very interested to hear how Matt, how has your position here developed, kind of in reference to this sort of response, and then also maybe share with people a little bit about your work, your books, your your background. We'll bring in the introductions a little bit late here into the conversation, but it is important because most of my audience hasn't seen you guys yet, and so. Yeah, let's and we'll do the same thing with Spencer.
Yeah, sure. Thanks a lot. And again, thanks a lot for having me on. So most of what we were talking about is from my forthcoming book, The Political Theory of Liberal Socialism. Don't look it up yet because there's not a webpage, but the should be up in a couple of weeks. If you're interested, you can check out my article for Aeon, excuse me, which kind of goes through some of the basics. But long story short, the argument that I put forward is that there is such a thing as a liberal socialist political theory. It has its roots in the writings of people like Thomas Paine and Mary Wollstonecraft. It really matures in the writings of people like John Stuart Mill, and then, Carlo Rosselli, Norberto Bobbio, a few others, John Maynard Keynes. And then I argue, ultimately, the most attractive form of liberal socialism would be some combination of Rawlsian normative theory with a kind of Marxist critique of power. That's just putting the book, very schematically. But to Spencer's points, first off, I want to say that I'm very happy to hear that he agrees that there's a kind of elective affinity between liberalism and socialism, or even that socialism is just intrinsically liberal in its orientation. Because the great liberal socialist and anti-fascist, I mean, he died fighting the Spanish fascist, Carlo Rosselli, once just said, exactly that. Socialism is just the extension of the liberal principle of liberty into the economy, with the goal of securing liberty for the poor or the working classes. And it's a definition of liberal socialism that I really like and I really appreciate. So to the kind of broader point about how this differs from what I might call an orthodox Marxist point of view, there are three things that I want to say. First off, Spencer is undoubtedly right, that if you take the view that ideologies or political ideologies or ideational content is just the expression of certain underpinning material conditions, then obviously there's going to be a problem in arguing that there can be a kind of independent liberal socialist political theory, because you contend that, well, liberalism is just the ideological expression of capitalism in a lot of different ways. But, against that, I would just say that I do not think that that's actually an appropriate way to understand political ideologies. And here I'm just not an orthodox Marxist. We can get into that if you want. And I like to point out that Marx and Engels weren't orthodox Marxist either, right? If you read the German ideology or the contribution to the critique of political economy in a kind of crude way, you might come away with the idea that political ideologies or political ideas are just superstructural, not really all that important. Obviously, a lot of people have made that claim. But Engels, in a late letter that he wrote, I think it was in the 1890s, used to say, look, we were never of the view that ideologies or ideas just don't matter, that everything is about material forces. We just felt compelled to emphasize or foreground the importance of material forces against those who tried to deny their significance. So they kind of overstated the point a little bit for polemical purposes, which I should add, I think is entirely appropriate, circa the 19th century. The second thing that I'd like to say is that from a dialectical or historical point, and this is what I pointed out in my earlier conversation with Spencer, I think there are good reasons to assume that Marx would have been critical of liberal socialism, yes, but sympathetic to other aspects of it. So the primary piece that I rely upon here is the critique of the Gotha program. And if people want a really good, close reading of this text in terms of its relationship with liberalism, they can look at my friend Igor Shukadbrod's revisiting Karl Marx's critique of liberalism. But basically what you see in the critique of the Gotha program is a critique of the utopian socialist impulse to suggest that post-revolution there's going to be a radical or millenarian change from the earlier mode of production and the earlier kind of society, which you still sometimes see in left circles, right? This idea that after the revolution, everything is going to be different. What Marx said was, no, actually, in a socialist future, we're very much going to see a continuation of many of the old institutions and the old ways of doing things, because any society that we create that is post-capitalist is going to be, in his terminology, stamped by many of the features of the old society. And he even makes a very interesting normative point on this, where he says, right can only be as high as the mode of production at any given time. And so this idea that you can transition from liberal right to communist right, let's call it that, is just, again, a utopian fantasy. There's going to have to be a very long transitional phase, which he never really talked about at great length, but I think this is the right way to understand it. So on that basis, I would argue that you can make an unorthodox, admittedly, Marxist argument for a kind of liberal socialism, claiming that what we're trying to do here is retain certain core principles of liberal right that are valuable for all the reasons that Spencer expressed in a transition to socialism, while at the same time radicalizing liberal principles about things like liberty and equality through their extension to the economy, which I suppose brings me to my last point, where I differ with Spencer, perhaps to a certain degree, which is I'm very comfortable with what we might call normative theorizing, right? Putting forward moral arguments for my position, which is expressed in the very title of my book, the political theory of liberal socialism. Now, a lot of Marxists are understandably quite critical of normative theorizing, saying things like, look, what we should be doing instead is dialectically analyzing the social form and the social totality as it exists right now, and demonstrating the way that certain contradictions emerge within it, and seizing political opportunities from an interpretation of those tensions and contradictions. And I want to be clear that I think that it's an extremely valuable theoretical enterprise, one that liberal socialists haven't done enough of. But I also think that there is something valuable in making moral arguments and developing programs for the future, so long as we are sensitive to material realities on the ground. Marx once had a disdainful kind of characterization of this, where he said, socialists who like to do this are essentially coming up with recipe books for the cook shops of the future. And certainly there are various forms of utopian socialism that I'd say fall into this paradigm. But the form of liberal socialism that I'm trying to argue for in my book is intended to take seriously the Marxist critique of power, and still put forward what looks like a realistic alternative to the status quo that is dialectical in its sensitivities, in the sense of acknowledging that, and again, any transition from liberalism is going to require, any transition from capitalism is going to require that we carry a lot of liberalism along with it. So that's the main argument I'd say I put forward for liberal socialism in 3 prongs.
Thank you. Yeah. Anything else that you want to say about the genesis of your work, or why or how you got involved in the left, or why it matters to you, just in terms of where you're coming from?
Well, it's a really cliche story, right? I'm a millennial. So the 2 things that were probably the most important for me were the war in Iraq and Afghanistan, right? That really radicalized me early on. And then there was a Great Recession, that happened around 2008. I was dirt poor for a while. Every friend I had knew was dirt poor. And, I didn't really have a way of thinking through that constructively at the time. I think it was only 19 or 20 or whatever it happens to be when the recession happened. But it did start to instill me, shall we say, with a kind of natal anti-capitalism. So that by the time I eventually got around to reading people like Marx, reading people like Adorno, Reading people like Žižek, who was a big formative influence on me, a lot of it just clicked and made sense to me in a way that it probably wouldn't have had I not gone through these kinds of experiences. So I think those are the two single biggest, life events or world events that encouraged me to transition to the left. And I guess if you want a third one, it was just reading a lot of critical theory, right? I was interested in this material. I thought it was really interesting. And I read a lot of it and I became convinced by it. Simple as that.
Wonderful. And Spencer, I'm sure you've got things you would like to say after all of that, but also in doing so, if you could say a little bit about your own background, the bit about maybe how you met
Sure.
Catrone and have been instrumental in Platypus and even what that is for people, that would be great. Because just quick
Sure.
aside, I am assuming like a non-leftist audience here. Like I know there's a lot of you here, maybe even a majority, but it's not all. And a lot of you come here for all kinds of other stuff that I'm doing that ain't that. So yeah.
Yeah, so I am a full generation older than Matt. From what he said, I guess he was born in the late 80s.
1988, baby.
Right. So 1989, I went to college. And I'm not like Chris, I wasn't like a leftist, right? I wanted to be a scholar, and I thought that being a scholar might open the way to being an intellectual. One of the things that, one of the stakes of Nietzsche is about that, right? It is about the crisis of the intellectual life. My formative influences or my mentors, I was very scholarly. I like to learn languages. I like to learn exotic histories. That's a side of me that will never find expression on a podcast. So I'm a scholar of South Asia and of South Asian languages. That's what my PhD is South Asian languages and civilizations, with a double PhD in history. My mentors were people like Richard Rorty, Jürgen Habermas. These are the people that I studied with in the 90s, and then when I went to graduate school, Moishe Pistone, and it was in the late 1990s, studying Marx in the Frankfurt School, that I met Chris, and he and I immediately hit it off, and had a few very productive years, I would say, of intensive dialogue with Moishe. Our relationship with Moishe began to sour when we formed Platypus. Platypus, I guess what I'll say is, like my role in Platypus, and that has to do, in a way with, why I have opinions about Nietzsche. I have opinions about Nietzsche because I love, powerful books and ideas, and I think they have to be grappled with, and I think Nietzsche's on that list. But I haven't, unlike Matt, I haven't published on Nietzsche, and I may never publish on Nietzsche. My students have, right? So there are essays that people can find by my friends and students, Sunit Singh, Jamie Kiesling, Ethan Linehan, all of whom in different ways have written about Nietzsche and Marx, Nietzsche and the Frankfurt School. And they express, I think, an entirely different, and I want to get to this, but maybe not just now, an entirely different approach to the question that's rooted in an ignored lineage or trajectory of thinkers, what I would term the dialectical tradition, that doesn't arise, that doesn't begin with fascism, that doesn't begin with Heidegger as the first reader of Nietzsche or the first reader of Note, or that doesn't, focus on Kaufman, and that certainly doesn't take, the post-war Lukács, or God help us, Domenico Lasordo, as any kind of last word on Nietzsche. About the points that Matt raised, the notion that ideologies express underlying social conditions has got nothing to do with Marxism. That's just straight liberalism. Liberalism is self-consciously the thought of commercial society. It's not that that this comes from somewhere else, right? The idea that forms of subjectivity are related to forms of social practice is an originary insight, especially of the High Enlightenment. So arising in figures like Rousseau, very clearly expressed in something like the Discourse on the Origin of Inequality, taken up by a figure like Adam Smith. Adam Smith, who has arguments about like effectively modes of production when you read the Theories of Jurisprudence, Kant, and Hegel, right? These are people who understand philosophy, in Hegel's immortal phrase, as the self-consciousness of their time in thought. And they mean their time in the fullest possible sense of the practices of society as a whole, both individuals relating to other individuals, individuals relating to themselves, society relating to nature, etc. So I wouldn't say that I'm making some kind of like special Marxist argument when I say that bourgeois thought is the self-consciousness of the emergence of bourgeois society. That is the thought of the Enlightenment, right? So, and that's what distinguishes modern philosophy, right? Is its historical self-awareness. As for the Marx and the critique of the Gotha program, or the larger issue, what I would say about what's really at issue with Matt's notion of liberal socialism is his embrace of a certain trajectory of revisionism, right? And he's honest about this, and I appreciate that.
Could you elaborate a little bit on what revisionism is for you? Because I kind of take on that position as an identity almost, because I've been called it enough times that I'm just like, fine. But what is it to you, and why does it matter?
You're a revisionist too, Dave, but less self-conscious than Matt. Matt embraces the notion, the argument of Edward Bernstein, which, after all, has had a lot more, in some sense, and if you will, in a kind of exoteric sense, a lot more purchase in the world, which is the notion that Marx's ideas are good for his time, and in order to be true to Marx, we have to revise him, right? That's the idea. That's Bernstein's idea, and he makes that into it, and that has consequences for the strategy and tactics for socialism. In particular, for Bernstein, the question of socialist revolution had to be revised, right? That the goal of revolution was nothing to him, right? The process
To
was
Bernstein.
everything. That's Edward Bernstein, right? Who's an immense socialist thinker, right?
Right.
It's a absolutely legitimate position for Matt to espouse, but it does mean that he doesn't view Marx and Marxism the way I do, right? And I would just say that the sort of the second order, I mean, Matt would focus on John Rawls as a inspiration, but I think the real question is, how does he think about Ralph Miliband? How does I'm glad that you're loved there, Dave. May we all be.
Spencer said that he's glad that I'm loved. Yeah, I'm doing a little like fake beer and cigarette break, but I've been streaming
Sure.
since like 5 a.m. So yeah, man, this is my little break. But thank you.
I hope you're not wearing diapers. I hope you've been able to take
No,
bathroom breaks.
I have. Yeah, I
So,
have it. My office chair is actually a toilet. It works out great,
so just on the issue of the critique of the Gotha program, right? What's going to persist? When Marx talks about the persistence of bourgeois right, what persist after what? Persist after socialist revolution, right? Persist after the seizure of state power, right? That's the issue, right? The issue, in other words, is the relationship of a political strategy to the transformation of society. And Marx is saying that the goal of socialism, the goal of the socialist workers' movement, is the establishment of the dictatorship of the proletariat, right? That's the limited goal of the various political formations, whether they're workers' councils, whether they're unions, whether they're socialist parties, right? Whatever political forms the socialist revolution may take place through, and of course those are different and have different roles in a political revolution. The transformation of society will only begin after that political project has taken place, right? That the actual transformation of our social relations, of the bourgeois social relations that we have, whereby we sell our labor to live, whereby we are commodities that sell our labor. That form of society, that underlying basis of our social cooperation, which is in crisis, can only be overcome after having established political conditions, namely that the working class is in power in the sense of having seized state power and replaced the agencies of coercion of the state with the working class, right? So rather than the police and the military, those forms would emerge out of the working class, whose political practice over decades would have prepared it to undertake that kind of responsibility, right? So that's what I would say is that what Marx is saying is, and of course it's a basic point, the working class seizing power isn't socialism. It doesn't create a free state, right? So it's an anti-Lassallean, anti-statist point, but it also isn't the achievement of socialism in the sense that you can just declare the state over, and like the anarchists want to just abolish the state, because the state is an expression. It's not only that our thought is an expression of our social relations and our social practices. The state, for Marx, is an expression of the self-contradiction of capital, right? That's what Bonapartism is, right? That's why we have cops. That's why we have armies. That's why there's a perpetual war in capital, right? Is that this is the way that, in the absence of the socialist workers movement achieving the dictatorship of the proletariat, which would, of course, have to deal with the self-contradiction of our social freedom. This is the way that self-contradiction of that social freedom is managed in the meantime. And so I'm holding up a completely, in a sense, utopian, in the sense of nobody thinks it's possible, right, memory of a project of socialism associated with Marxism, associated with orthodox Marxism, associated with revolutionary Marxism. Because I think that project, even if that project is impossible, in the present. And I heard your comments about, oh, social conditions are different and the PMC is closer to the levers of power and all of this. I would say that the failure of socialism, not as an idea, not as like a philosophical debate that failed, but as a failure in real history, right? As a failure that's happening all around us, and it's a material fact. A failure of socialist revolution that's in this pencil, right? That phenomenon is not going away, right? There's a reason why we're haunted by Marxism, right? And that we don't just move on, because it's a debunked, it's an exploded, it's a historically discarded ideology, except for the fact that we keep turning to it. And you have to ask yourself, why? What are the real reasons for that? Is that just a failure of imagination? Or is there an actual historical fact in ourselves, in our society, in a newborn baby, and in this, and in the layout of our cities, that expresses the failure of a historical project? So that, I think, also addresses what I would say to Matt about normative theorizing, right? I think that normative theorizing depends upon a conception of history, whereas I would say that that history, and specifically the history of Marxism, weighs upon the living like a nightmare. Right, that it is with us, and we're not simply in a position to, in a presentist and a historical way, theorize normatively, but rather we're tasked to work through the regression and catastrophe of the 20th century.
Okay, I think that's a really good setup here for all of my questions that I'll have related to reading and how we're reading and blah, blah, blah. But before I ask those, let's let Matt respond.
Sure, thanks. Well, I wanted to say 3 key things, right? So the first one is I certainly don't think we should be discarding Marx. In fact, my livelihood in part depends on us not discarding Marx. With Marion Trail and Ben Burgess, we have an essay collection coming out soon, Flowers for Marx, which kind of makes the case for its enduring relevance on the 21st century. So just anyone listening, I'm certainly not anti-Marx in any way, shape, or form. Spencer is right, though, in the sense that I'm a revisionist, in the sense that I think to be a proper historical materialist, one always needs to be cognizant of the material realities on the ground, right? What is valuable about Marx's method is not how it presents us with a kind of trans-historical analytic of power or even of capital, right? But instead offers us a method to pierce through the various ideological forms of reification that are present at any given time, to understand the inner operations of the social totality and how it instantiates various forms of domination. And I think to be true to that method, we need to update our account of capital and the social totality for whatever kind of period we happen to be living in. And I think there's some great Marxist theorists that are doing that right now, right? I mentioned Soren Mao in Chicago, and I'll do that again. I think his work, Mute Compulsion, is really fantastic as a kind of 21st century Marxist theory that is true to the spirit, while not necessarily being beholden to a 19th century historical framework. Now, how that relates back to liberal socialism, which is my second point, is that I certainly do not think that any consistent liberal socialism purely needs to be committed to a conventional or parliamentary route to power, right? One of the things that I continuously foreground is that liberalism itself has a revolutionary history that it is very, very much tried to forget, right? This is a point that I bring up from drawing upon Samuel Moyn, right? So Samuel Moyn has a very good book that came out not too long ago called The Liberalism Against Itself, where he points out that throughout the 20th century, many liberal thinkers internalized a lot of conservative authors and their points about the need for order, regularity, a lack of utopian ambition, and kind of recharacterized liberal tradition as fundamentally being about very similar kinds of things to what conservatives have always argued for. And Martin points out that, of course, liberalism came into the world as a fighting and indeed revolutionary creed, right? That Marx very much understood, right? It brought about a fundamental transformation in society. It committed society in a way that had never been seen before to liberty, equality, and solidarity or fraternity. But the revolution, in many senses, was incomplete, precisely because very few liberals, with a few exceptions that I talk about in my book, in the 18th century were cognizant of the importance of challenging economic forms of power, the way that many liberals, or almost every liberal, was cognizant in the 18th century about the necessity of challenging political forms of power, namely the aristocracy. So what I would argue, right, is that what liberalism needs to do to make itself relevant in the 21st century is to complete this ambition of trying to achieve a society committed to liberty, equality, and fraternity for all. God, I want a cigarette because of the two of you right now. Soon. Where was I? Yes, complete the project of securing a society committed to liberty, equality, and fraternity for all, precisely through extending liberal principles to the economy where they have not been extended historically. And I think there's a lot of great work being done by liberal and liberal socialist political theorists and activists right now, precisely to think through how it is that we could complete the revolutionary project of liberalism by engaging in this kinds of extension and challenging forms of economic domination. Just one person that comes immediately to mind is Elizabeth Anderson, also at the University of Michigan, who wrote a great book recently, Private Government, where she talks about how most Americans would not tolerate the kind of things that you experience in the workplace if the government was to carry them out. Say things like, bathroom breaks requiring you to wear a uniform. If anything, they would have a revolution. But she says there's something extremely odd about the fact that Americans will be liberals in relation to their government and demand rights, political participation, certain kinds of agency in relation to government, but they won't demand those in relationship to economic firms, where we actually spend a lot more of our time. So that's my second point. And then the third point that I wanted to make, which I suppose brings us back to Nietzsche, is again, I do to a certain extent reject Spencer's characterization of liberalism as purely an expression of changes in the economic mode of production. This is where I don't really empathize with economic reductionism. If anything, my understanding of liberalism owes quite a bit more to Nietzsche in a positive sense. Because one of the things that Nietzsche points out is that liberalism, socialism, and the commitment to democracy all share a deep spiritual core in terms of their commitment to human equality and the importance of human equality. And it's precisely this core commitment to equality that makes Nietzsche so insistent that we need to reject liberalism, socialism, and democracy, and indeed their predecessors like Christianity, and go in many ways back to a more aristocratic way of organizing society that I think is necessary to confront the nihilism of the time. And I think once you take this Nietzschean read on history and you realize this deep affinity between liberalism, socialism, and democracy, you realize in a way that I think is quite important how all these doctrines are very, very contrary to the way that the political right wants to organize society. Because liberals, socialists, Democrats, at their core believe that people are moral equals and that moral equals should live in a society that's characterized by liberty, equality, and fraternity for all. Whereas the political right is committed to this idea, qua Nietzsche, that there are recognizably superior people in society, and that it's better off for society to be a hierarchy where the recognizably superior people, whoever they are, wield enormous amounts of power over everyone else. And I would hope that all of us, liberals, socialists, and Democrats, would reject that. And given the ascendancy of the right now, I think it's more important than ever that we foreground the things that bind us together rather than the very serious, but I'd say less serious differences that often drive us apart.
All right. I have to, okay, if you want to smoke a cigarette, Matt, now would be a good time. You can go for it. Everyone gets a turn.
I need to go all the way down my elevator and outside, so I'll be back in fucking like half an hour.
Oh man,
and if I'm going all the way down there, it would need to be 2 cigarettes at the very least to make it worthwhile.
Yeah, not yet then. Well, okay, this is great. We've got
luckily,
a lot.
Luckily, my office is on the ground floor.
Good, yeah. Well, we've got not mine. I had to go all the way down there, but it worked out. So, all right, my big question then for you, Spencer, I'll have one for Matt, but my big one for you, Spencer, is why you taking all of these shots at Lizardo when last time you were on you said you hadn't read his like 800-page work on Nietzsche the aristocratic rebel. Like that's a pretty important document when it comes to making sense of his politics, which, as Matt characterized, are reactionary. And for me, reactionary is not the most meaningful term anymore. Being commonsensical in a million different ways today can get you called that. So it's a term people throw around. But when it comes to Nietzsche, like the way I say it in the afterword of my book was, he's not our friend if we're workers, because from his standpoint, he would be happy for us to stay as workers. He's actually freaked out by the idea that workers might get a taste of free time and want it. And for me, that's a goal. And I have had a taste of it and I do want more of it. And so, it's like, oh, he's kind of an enemy in that sense, but he's also, I agree, like an inspiration in a sort of sense. Like he's also a fantastic writer. And there's a sort of debt I do have to him. I know that Matt doesn't like the critique from the standpoint of ressentiment. I get a lot of mileage from that, but I'm open to that conversation. But what Lizardo did for me, and I get it, you called him a Stalinist and all this other stuff, but it's like we can get into that. But at the level of what he did, with his operating assumptions, going in and reading Nietzsche as closely as he did, is unearth like a continuous thread and tendency throughout his entire body of work that is very, very for leisure time for the aristocrats, and everybody else works and works and works, right? And that we can say like, well, no, but that's
No.
not. Well, how can you say no if you didn't even read it?
Well, I have read it since.
You read it, the whole thing since that conversation?
I've read the whole thing, but I've read as much as I could stomach.
Okay. So take it away. What's your position on Lizardo? Why don't you like him? You didn't like him before you read him. Now you read him and you still don't like him. So what's your position on Lizardo?
Okay, I'm just going to make one comment about what Matt said.
Okay.
Again, because he's trying to paint me as this like crude materialist, right? The issue of bourgeois social relations is an issue of freedom, right? It's not just an issue of, materiality. And again, there's a critique of materialism as conservative that's bourgeois that I agree with. Right? Rousseau criticizes the Enlightenment's materialism. He declares himself a Christian philosopher because he believes in the freedom of man. Right? He believes in the self-transformability of mankind. And of course, bourgeois thinkers are not. They don't think of the economy as a realm devoid of freedom, right? So the comments about, we should extend liberalism into the economy, liberalism's constitutively extended into the economy. We have, it's about social cooperation. It's about the transformation of our relationship to nature. It's about the way that we're continually transforming the labor process. It's about the unleashing of human ingenuity in how we make things. It's about the fact that we're no longer slaves, right? It's about the fact that we are free as workers, and it is in the name of the third estate, right? The bourgeois revolutions are revolutions of the third estate. These are free people who are workers. Of course, capitalists are, or what we would call capitalists, are included in that. And it's, I don't want to go into why, but it's important to think about why, because we still think that. And yes, liberalism has a venerable revolutionary tradition. In fact, any future revolution will be in the name of bourgeois rights. It will be in the name of, limiting the power of the imperial state. It will be in the name of the rights of the individual. It will be in the name of the rights of free speech. It will be in the name of the rights of labor, which is a bourgeois right, right? It's not, this is a canard that, the economy is somehow it's just a domain of, quote, exploitation, unquote, right? Being a free laborer is the basis of our freedom. And the problem is that free labor is not available, right? The problem is that there's a crisis of the commodity form. The problem is that there's an immense amount of unemployment. There's an immense amount of conformity as a result of the need to find employment, right? To fit in. There's a deep authoritarianism. It has all kinds of ideological significance. It's not a merely material fact. Again, it's a crisis of freedom. About Nietzsche. This notion that you first start, this is what I said to you last time, that you first decide whether someone is right wing or not, is the wrong way to read. What's at stake in Losordo and in Lukács, who's a much deeper thinker, even the late Lukács, the Lukács of the destruction of reason, is a more interesting thinker. He's a more interesting Stalinist than Losordo. Losordo argues by guilt by association. He's constantly bringing in right-wing thinkers to illustrate his points as if they apply to Nietzsche. He claims that Nietzsche is a German nationalist. This is just plainly wrong on the facts. Right? Nietzsche is a good European. He's a critic of German nationalism. He's a critic of German imperialism. He hates the thinking of his age because he sees it as aligned with German imperialism. It's right there in the essay on David Strauss, and it's consistent throughout. The essay on David Strauss is in Untimely Meditations. It's at the heart of his break with Schopenhauer and his break with Wagner. And he is arguing, and this gets to the last conversation, that the destiny of Christianity, as and the way I would put it is that Nietzsche is the last young Hegelian. Right? He's thinking through the Hegelian problematic in a way that's deeply tied to the contemporaries of Marx, Marx's milieu, and people like Feuerbach, people like Bruno Bauer, etc. And so he sees the crisis of bourgeois society as a crisis of the whole of history. And so he gives you this very complex, very heady story about the entire trajectory of Western civilization. I'm talking here specifically about, I think the Nietzsche that you ultimately have to hang your hat on. Nietzsche in his last writings, in The Genealogy of Morals, in Beyond Good and Evil, in Ecce Homo, in The Antichrist, in The Twilight of the Idols, in the case of Wagner, right? That whole wonderful body of work. And he's saying that science and that the men of science, the intellectuals of his day, are the true heirs of Christianity, the true heirs of the ascetic ideal, right? And that the science and in the other, so it's a crisis of, if you will, the scholars and intellectuals who he sees as having betrayed the promise of the Enlightenment, right? Who are completely bound up with their projects and think, and do very good work, and they go through all their archives. He tends to talk about historians and the like, philologists like himself. But they are not men who are contributing to the self-overcoming of the crisis of society, but rather expressions of it. And the socialist intellectuals are likewise expressions of the crisis of the ascetic ideal. People like Eugene Goering, who are filling the working class with the idea of the need to create a workers' society rather than to overcome the society based on work. And therefore, they are filling the working class with long expostulations and sermonizing about the dignity of work. They are, if you will, workerists. And it's a totalizing critique of the entirety of society, the totality of society. That's why he can talk about the planet Earth as a kind of, misery chamber, right? What would we look like to aliens, right? He's not talking about just the working class or the socialists being the problem. He's talking about a crisis of the entire society in its highest expressions, in its highest symptoms: science, socialist intellectualism, the working class, right? And he's arguing for the self-overcoming of their crisis, right? That they represent, in some sense, the legacy of the Enlightenment, even as they represent a regression from the Enlightenment. This is where the deep resonance with Marx is, right? This is why Marx doesn't think there are any more philosophers, that all philosophy is sub-Hegelian, why all political economy is sub-bourgeois and vulgar, why he thinks the working class is a symptom of a crisis, that it has to work through itself, it has to overcome itself, it has to overcome the proletarian condition. This is the deep interest of Nietzsche, and it's a legacy to the whole of modernism, right? This is where, like, Losordo's account that is just taken over by these new, pardon my saying so, millennial anti-Nietzscheans. They don't read Karl Jaspers. They're not reading Samuel Beckett. They're not reading Albert Camus. They're not reading Karl Löwit. They're not reading Thomas Mann. They're not reading George Bernard Shaw or William Butler Yeats or Max Weber or Stefan Zweig, or on and on and on. The highest expressions in literature and in philosophy of the 20th century, right? Except for Heidegger, who's read narrowly as a fascist, right? Which I think, is an important thing to note, but there's a much wider milieu there that he's a part of, and including the modernist milieu of Weimar Germany. And I think, you get this kind of, Stalinist affirmation of realist literature, of socialist art, anti-modernism, right? When you just say Nietzsche's an aristocratic, which is just wrong, right? It's just, first of all, it's wrong, but secondly, it's a discarding of an entire legacy intellectually that you can see in the way that Losordo reads, right? Losordo just doesn't think that any of that matters, right? He can just say, how does he put it? It's Heidegger, it's Elizabeth Forster Nietzsche and Heidegger. That's the first phase of Nietzsche's reception. Then it's Walter Kaufmann. Then it's the only thing that the millennials are taught by their professors, namely post-structuralism, right? What their professors learned in graduate school. So it's Deleuze and Foucault. And then it's leftists who have discarded Nietzsche, like Malcolm Bull and Domenico Losordo, right? And it's a very narrow conception of the significance of Nietzsche and the implications of Nietzsche intellectually. Why is that important? Marxism should not be afraid of the whole legacy. Who else read Nietzsche? Freud read Nietzsche. Who didn't read Nietzsche? That's in the 20th century, right? What does it mean to just discard this and say it's right wing? He's in favor of the aristocracy, really? He's
Yeah.
criticizing himself. He's criticizing himself. He is the highest embodiment of the ascetic ideal. He is to overcome himself. His society is to overcome itself. It's an utterly Hegelian critique of the legacy of Hegel, of the legacy of the Enlightenment. That's the deep resonance with Marx, is that it's a dialectical critique of the crisis of the dialectic. Right, this is what I was saying last time. Nietzsche's a negative dialectician. So what is the Marxist Nietzsche that they have to throw out? They act like it doesn't exist. These are gigantic thinkers. Lukács, Walter Benjamin, Adorno. I know you want to discard those. I heard you say that earlier, Dave, right? Oh, these few Marxist thinkers. These are the essential thinkers of Marxism in the 20th century, right? If you want to understand how you get the antinomy of logical positivism and fundamental ontology, right? How do you grasp that? It's the disintegration of dialectical thinking in the 20th century. Who's going to tell you about that? Okay, it's a handful of thinkers. Maybe it's a threadbare legacy, but that's the legacy that I stand on. And as I say, other people who that I've helped to educate make this argument. They make it in places like the Platypus Review or Sublation, and I know that everyone can dismiss that, right? But they're advancing the Marxist negative dialectical argument, which I think is most profoundly expressed in Adorno's and Horkheimer's Dialectic of Enlightenment, but deeply influenced by Benjamin. And it's not a right-wing legacy at all, and it's not, trying to turn Nietzsche into something else. It's about getting at the core of his thought, which, taking him as like affirmative of the dominating classes of Greece or the Middle Ages, is totally missing his analysis of his time. He's not in favor of the people who think that the opposite of good is bad and opposing the Christians. He's identifying himself as a legatee, as an heir of Christianity, as an heir of the Enlightenment. He's making it very clear, right? And that's why, Lasordo, it's lazy. No serious scholar could read this way, where you just say, well, there were these other thinkers who were talking about Germany this way, or there are these other thinkers who were talking about the legacy of Christianity, and they were right-wing, and what they said is this. And Nietzsche's broadly resonant with that. No, what is Nietzsche saying? Why is he, one of the handful of the most important modern philosophers, up there with Kant and Hegel, right? No one would be that lazy with Kant or Hegel, right? That's why, this, and I don't care how many millennials historical materialism gets to promote that book, right? It's rotten. And it's lazy.
Hey, first of all, Lizardo's no millennial. He's
the defenders of it.
He's of your generation, isn't he? Is he, or maybe?
No, he's a boomer. I'm not a boomer. He's old.
Okay.
Yeah, he's a new leftist.
Well, I want to push back on the generational thing later, but for now, I really want to just let Matt have the floor for as long as he needs. We have about what just happened? Do we lose Spencer?
Oh, I don't know.
Oh, it's messing up.
Savoy claimed him.
No, I'm here. I just had to get up for a second.
Oh, okay, no worries. Okay, well, I want Matt, you to take as long as you need to respond, but also we'll be closing out here in the next 14 minutes, and I want to make sure you both kind of get to say some closing statements that are more of an invitation for more thought on the part of the audience, maybe for you both in the future when you have conversations either here or elsewhere. But, because we'll never get to really do the thing. But for now, I hope that this is a call to action for everybody to look into these matters for themselves, to read the Platypus Review, to read Matt, to read Tut, to think about this. Maybe check out Lizardo on your own, come to your own conclusions. But also, I know I kind of have to go back to it now with this perspective, and I'll be thinking about it for sure for the next year. But for now, Matt, take it away.
Sure. Well, there are a few things I wanted to say just before I begin my core discussion. The first one is I don't think that any millennials are saying we should cancel Nietzsche or dismiss Nietzsche. In no small part because I think that a lot of the most influential figures on my generation precisely were Nietzscheans or profoundly inspired by Nietzsche, right? Michel Foucault or Gilles Deleuze are just two examples of the ones that Spencer mentioned, but we don't even need to go back that far, right? I think the greatest working political theorist right now is an author called Wendy Brown, who some people might have heard of. And she has done an enormously good thing in applying Nietzschean concepts like ressentiment to understand the operations of neoliberalism post-Trump in particular. So I think there's an enormous amount of gas left in the Nietzschean tank. And no millennial I know is interested in canceling Nietzsche. What we want to do is kind of resituate him politically where he belongs, so that if we do decide to read like a parasite, to use Tut's terms, and take things from Nietzsche, we do so self-consciously. The second thing I wanted to say, just in defense of Lacerda, is I don't really think anybody who wrote a 1,000-page book on any figure can be characterized as lazy, right? And I want to make it clear, right, that when Lacerda characterizes Nietzsche as a nationalist, the point that he was trying to make was that was early in Nietzsche's intellectual career. The time when Nietzsche, for instance, signed up to participate in the Prussian army in the Franco-Prussian War, precisely because he felt this kind of Germanophilic desire to destroy the French Revolution, in particular after the French Commune emerged. But certainly by the time he hit his middle period and his late period, he evolved well beyond that in the way that Spencer described, right? Coming to feel contemptuous of German nationalism, although for specific reasons, which leads me to my main point, right? I just don't think there is denying politically that Nietzsche fundamentally is a reactionary and an aristocratic radical. I'm not a conservative, I want to be clear. And this is also where I think we need to be careful in understanding how the right operates. So I pulled up a quote from Nietzsche in The Gay Science, which is the point where I think you start to see his mature political views emerging. And then I'll discuss them in my own terms a little bit afterwards. So in The Gay Science, he says, "We conserve nothing, neither do we want to return to any past periods. We are not by any means liberal. We do not work for progress. We do not need to plug up our ears against the sirens who in the marketplace sing of the future. Their songs about equal rights, a free society, no more masters and no more servants has no allure for us. We simply do not consider it desirable that a realm of justice and concord should be established on earth. We are delighted with all who love, as we do, danger, war, and adventure, and refuse to compromise, to be captured, reconciled, and castrated. We count ourselves among conquerors. We think about the necessity for new orders, and also for a new kind of slavery. For every strengthening and enhancement of the human type also involves a new type of enslavement," right? And this is very important in understanding his transition to aristocratic radicalism, right? Nietzsche did not think that the conservatives of his day were competent to push back the tide of egalitarian minority in a way that he saw was sufficient. And he makes this very clear in The Antichrist, right? So in The Antichrist, where he's talking about the emergence of socialist movements, who I also want to point out in The Antichrist, he says he hates above all others for ruining the working man's instincts for servitude. But he says, look, in Germany around the time of Otto von Bismarck, workers are being given way too much power. They're being educated. They're being taught that they're entitled to political participation. And Nietzsche says, what a foolish idea, right? We want to establish, in a very racist way, what he calls a race of Chinamen as workers who will be content with their lot. And he says, why would you want to educate the workers to be anything more than Chinamen? If you want to have active political citizens in the way that many conservatives say they don't, then you should obviously educate them to be this. But if you want a nation of slaves, which is what you should really want, then you train them to be slaves. So this is Nietzsche essentially castigating the imperial conservative government of the time for not going far enough in crushing the socialist movement and building up the workers' instincts for political agency. So everywhere you look throughout Nietzsche's oeuvre, you see commentary of this sort, right? And the will to power, right? He insists that Christianity is just, as he put it, or socialism is just the residue of Christianity and Rousseau, and is fundamentally a decadent and nihilistic philosophy that needs to be rejected for what he calls a society of rank ordering. Now, the reason why he hates all these things is very complicated, so I'm just going to give an abbreviated version here. But it's also the case that he doesn't want to simply return, again, to any old ruling class, precisely because older ruling classes failed to contain the thrust of egalitarian modernity. So on Nietzsche's telling, right, what emerged with the world with the transition to Christianity is the slave morality, right, with its bifurcation between good and evil. And what the slave morality was able to accomplish that he thinks is remarkable is precisely ruining the instincts of the aristocrats by getting them to internalize for the first time these real feelings of guilt about being aristocrats and to transition society away from an aristocratic society to one that was a lot more egalitarian in its orientation through the medieval era. And one of the things that he thinks is remarkable is that Christian morality eventually gave birth to the conditions that led to the erosion of Christian ontology. And he's very expressive about this in the Genealogy of Morals, where he says that all great things bring about their own self-overcoming. And it's the Christian will to truth that eventually led to the death of God, for example, because this will to truth eventually led Christianity to its most striking inference, the inference against itself, as he puts it, where people started to ask, is God actually real? Motivated by this desire to be faithful to the truth that Christianity had taught them. And what he was deeply disappointed by was even though Christian metaphysics was disappearing, nonetheless, Christian morality was still continuing, albeit in radicalized and secularized form, where he's very expressed that the inheritors of this Christian slave morality are things like liberalism, democracy, and above all, socialism, which is why he said he hated it above all other things, because it has this poisonous doctrine of equal rights for all. It rejects the idea of an aristocratic society, and it's going to bring about a decadent and nihilistic society, precisely because the working man or the average people or the herd should not be in charge of society. They're only going to bring about a debasement of the culture. Now, had Nietzsche lived longer, it's quite possible he would have developed his own political theory or account of the ideal society that was going to overcome this decadent egalitarianism that he saw sweeping over the world. But he gives us a lot of clues about what this would look like, right? So in Beyond Good and Evil, he says, every elevation of the type man has hitherto been the work of an aristocratic society, and so it always will be. A society which believes in a long scale of orders of rank and differences of worth between man and needs slavery in some sense or other. Without the pathos of distance such as develops from the incarnate differences of classes, from the ruling classes constant looking out and looking down on subjects and instruments, and from its equally constant exercise of obedience and command, it's holding down and holding at a distance that other, more mysterious pathos could not have developed either. In short, precisely the elevation of the type man, the continual self-overcoming of man, to take a moral formula in a supra-moral sense. So Nietzsche is very express about this need for aristocracy, not just because he thinks politically and institutionally it's necessary to counteract the thrust of egalitarianism, but precisely because by establishing aristocracy, you develop the kind of people who become used to commanding, used to ordering, used to transforming the masses into instruments for the pursuit of great projects. And this was Nietzsche in his more PC mode. Let's just put it this way. In The Will to Power, he could be even more ruthless, where at one point he actually says, I do not grant the great mass of people, the unfit, as it calls them, any right to life. There are unfit peoples, and they're not entitled to life, right? And Jorge Brandes, who coined the term aristocratic radicalism, was one of the first people to detect this kind of radical reactionary or radical right instinct in Nietzsche. And he wrote to him and said, I'm characterizing your philosophy as a kind of aristocratic radicalism. And Nietzsche wrote back to him saying, that is the cleverest thing anyone has yet written about me. What a wonderful idea, right? You got it exactly right. So when Lacerdo characterizes Nietzsche as an aristocratic radical, we don't need to take Lacerdo's word for it. Brandes is the one who coined the term, yes, but Nietzsche signed off on it and thought, yes, that's correct, right? So just to wrap up, all this isn't any kind of call for canceling Nietzsche or denying the kind of existential value of Nietzsche as a thinker. And I should point out, autobiographically, right? I was profoundly moved by Nietzsche and became interested in Nietzsche precisely when I did lose my faith and read people like Camus and read people like Yeats and T.S. Eliot to try to think through my own kind of spiritual crises. And I think he can be very valuable that way. But if as leftists we are going to draw upon Nietzsche, we need to be very clear about his own political orientation and, to use Tut's term again, read him like a parasite, appropriate the kind of things that are useful and constructive for a left-wing project, while recognizing that Nietzsche himself would be very contemptuous of us doing so because he was, at his core, an aristocratic radical.
Do we have time for me to respond to that?
Not really, actually. I've got to close it out here. So, I mean, maybe hint at a response that will come. That
Okay.
all of these conversations are kind of overflowing their parameters, but that's good. I think it will provoke a lot of thought from everybody. And so, thank you, both of you. you can each, say your goodbyes basically, and tell people where to find you.
Well, people can read my books. They're out. I've edited a couple of volumes of Marx. There's more to come. They can read the second volume of the Platypus Review Reader, which I just finished. But I'm not really online. So I just wanted to say that Marxism is a critique of progress. Marxism is not progressive, right? Marxism, and that's the fundamental difference, right, with the kind of revisionist stream of thought that Matt has, right? I would identify Matt's thought as being much more in that mode of, what I would argue is a kind of statist progressive liberalism. When Nietzsche says that socialism is decadent, he's saying it's a high expression of his time, right? His whole society is decadent, right? That's why it's an analysis of, that's why it's not about progress. It's about how what looks like progress is driving regress, right? That's the profound resonance with Marxism, once again, right? When you read him saying we need a new slavery, right? You, first of all, have to understand that Nietzsche, of course, as I talked about last time, is not a politically responsible thinker. No politically responsible person would put it this way. But what does he mean? He means, as Matt rightly points out, that slavery and the slave revolt of morality is what has made humanity interesting. He's constantly talking about how much healthier aristocratic society and aristocratic values are. They're healthy because they're animal. He's constantly describing human history in zoomorphic terms, in terms of the animal kingdom, because the same values of nature that exist in the animal kingdom have persisted into human history. So the aristocracy is like beasts of prey. The slaves are like sheep.
Mm-hmm.
The priests are a shepherd, right? Mm-hmm. He's constantly playing on this language. Slavery made man interesting, made man free, made man unnatural. Right. That's Rousseauian to the core, right? Just go start with the discourse on the origin of inequality. And so when Nietzsche talks about mankind needs a new slavery, he's saying we need to subject ourselves to a new world historic discipline, right? It's a freedom that involves giving the law to yourself, right? So freedom is indistinguishable in all of human history from the self-enslavement of mankind, right? So Nietzsche's playing, and you have to learn how to read. And like I said, it's not going to be politically responsible. You have to enter into the spirit of it.
I have to cut it there, but I do want to say that I think
sure,
Matt,
I'm done.
I think Matt knows how to read, but there's a big question about hermeneutics that you do raise here. And I know what you mean when you say this. You're not trying to be insulting. So I will invite you both, if you want, to write up a little reflection on this about how you do read and why you read the way you do for the Discourse in Search of a Method anthology Theory Underground is putting out in this fall, or at least we're accepting proposals for it. And basically, we're going to have a bunch of pieces on how to read, why you read the way you do, or maybe how not to read. And the question of method is very important. A lot of people think in this sort of post-Protestant world that's functionally illiterate and structurally stultified of Timenergy, the text just speaks on its own. And of course, that's not true. I think you both know that you have to bring some kind of a method to the text. You both have a different method. And I look forward to following up on that, hopefully in writing, and then we can talk more. But for now, I really do have to cut it off, and I hate having to do that. I really do appreciate both of you. Thank you so much for bringing it today. Take care.
Yeah, take care, guys.
Thanks, Matt.
We
Thanks, Dave.
cannot do direct revolution, but the only way to lay the foundation for it is to do what you are doing to move the underground. It's a theoretically correct title.
Welcome to Theory Underground, a place for workers with earbuds who are tired of the bullshit and just want to get down to it. Big ideas, rigorous thinking, and ultimately liberation from necessity.
Research at Theory Underground focuses on what is most important for understanding our current situation. Theory of the subject, capital, time-energy theory, critical media theory, CMT, and the most essential critiques necessary for understanding why the theory, ideology, and common sense of influencers left to right misses the mark.
Theory Underground is coming to a city near you. Besides a commitment to publishing certain underground theorists and popularizing certain fundamental concepts, we have toured the United States and are touring Europe to promote our ideas, courses, and publications. You've been reading Underground Theory.
Amazing book. I'm a publisher and an editor. I run a review of books. Literally, it's my living. This is the best edited collection I've ever read.
Okay, picture this scene. America, early 2021. An Amazon warehouse worker arises from the emerging underground theory internet scene to create spaces for untimely topics and concerns that are too often neglected or kept in isolation today. Joined by a revolving cast of underground theorists, academics, and critics, he establishes what will become Theory Underground, a teaching, research, and publishing platform by and for working class intellectuals, autodidacts, and academics who want to do more than they're able to do within the confines of academia. That warehouse worker's name is David McKerracher, and his book Timenergy is his first major contribution to the world of theory. It was recently reprinted with a foreword by none other than Slavoj Žižek, who also contributed to Theory Underground's latest book.
My Bible, it's an excellent book.
A collection of essays called Underground Theory.
What you just heard is an excerpt from the Strange Exiles podcast, episode 23, where Bram from Strange Exiles interviewed me and Mikey. For those who don't know, Mikey is the author of the Dangerous Maybe blog. We are publishing one of his books here shortly at Theory Underground. He's also a lecturer at Theory Underground, and he's someone I've been friends and a collaborator with for over 10 years. But most importantly for you all, he's a fantastic lecturer, and it's a crime that he has to do wage labor right now. One of the long-term goals of Theory Underground has been now for a couple of years to hashtag Free Mikey. That is something that I've been really pushing, but first, obviously, I have to get freed myself, so the two of us are able to do this because, you know, as Mikey said, build it and they will come. Well, I tried and I built a website and platform. I had my own app and everything, but it's been really buggy and it's more than one person can handle, and that's, you know what, a really good lesson for me. And so for now, what we're doing is moving it to a temporary intermediary platform until we are able to get some more serious funding. And ultimately, we want to be in a place like this, a real brick and mortar digital nomadic mecca where people can come from all over the world. But also, the app was really expensive, and so by quitting it, I am now able to save a lot of money, and with the help of my patrons and the students at Theory Underground, especially the monthly subscribers, I am officially able to quit Amazon and do Theory Underground full time. So thank you so much, everybody. This is one huge step forward. With that said, several subscribers did not migrate from the now defunct app to the new setup, and I'm guaranteed to lose people over time. So please, if you want to get involved, become a subscriber. If you're not even sure what this is all about but are just curious, then I've added tier 0 and tier 1 for very basic kinds of access to what we are doing behind the scenes. If you don't have any time or energy to get involved, but you do have some money to help support this project from afar, then please check out the Patreon. My patrons over at Patreon make the podcast and public YouTube possible. Thank you. As for once-in-a-lifetime events, check out the new poster for the American Idiots Theory Underground European Book Tour. Paris, Brussels, Berlin, Vienna, Linz, Krakow, Glasgow, London, and Oxford from April 27th to May 25th, 2024. 2 events are already fully booked out. Save a seat at an event by getting in contact with us ASAP. Finally, the call for proposals to our conference in Mexico.
What's up, everybody? TUCon 2024 update here. It's not happening in Mexico anymore, but it is still happening on October 24th through the 27th.
The change was made because a lot of the people that wanted to attend and that were expected to attend said they could probably afford to travel if they had more time advance notice. So save up for June 2025.
If you have to choose, right? Because this one that is happening this year is happening physically in Boise, Idaho, because we have a lot of collaborators and fellow travelers and co-instructors there. But you can attend virtually for this one. You won't be able to attend virtually next year. So yeah, if you have to choose, attend physically in 2025. The call for proposals already happened. The writing workshop for proposals already happened. You can still get the links to both of those. Just shoot us a message and ask for those links. We'll get you those. And the form goes live on June 1st, and the deadline is June 15th. So if you're attending physically, let me know ASAP.
Get in on it.
All right. Finally, last little thing here is to say thank you so much to my patrons over at Patreon. The Patreon is for people who are too busy to be students or subscribers at Theory Underground, but who want to see more of this free content on the podcast and YouTube channel for Theory Underground. You are the ones who see something of value in the free content being made available here, and you want to see more of it. Your patron pledges at Patreon are a real motivator for me, so thank you so much. Especially thanks to Marilyn Lawrence, Bert Vanderkar, Carl Vanderlip, Nikolai, Sahil Kumar, Suxandra, Darian Large, Tyler Murphy, Max Mackin, Al, Algeri, Ben Rosenblum, Atlantic Airlines, Lewis, Matt Payne, Neil C., Simon Condon, Yiz, and Schwabkinson. Thank you.